Dear Professor, Professor T, uh, this would have to be the Wednesday that we have before class, and it is late in the afternoon. In regards to the creepy book or the creepy story that you wanted us to cover at this point over here, and I'm not quite sure how people would consider this as something of a while worthy story to read. It's the most vile, disgusting, god awful thing I'd rather get the raid bottle and start using it on. Professor, I have read other sci fi books in my life that usually would leave nightmares because they're that well written. There was a Star Trek novel out there back in the 90s, 2000s. And this particular one dealt with the Enterprise landing on a planet, dealing with an ancient civilization long ago dead. However, left remnants of it where people kept trying to figure the thing out, and yet the Enterprise kept reading life forms happening where they couldn't scan it. Well, what the landing party didn't understand was they were turning into the creatures, and they were crawling around, and they were the same ones that the Enterprise was picking up on. The creatures being my least favorite creatures in all the known universe, and I'd like to have them extinguished. Crabs. Doesn't matter what kind of crab the damn thing is, it's a crab. And I'd rather have the damn thing destroyed, thank you very much, mutilated, gone off the history of the world. Unfortunately, it's still there, so I have to avoid it like all costs, and I have nightmares over it ever since. Having that book image of the author's exact descriptions of how this thing works and its mentality is exactly the same thing that I've been reading here. I think Ed Wood, back in the 50s and 60s, or probably in the 40s, would have a field day with this one. I know they all did back in those days because we dealt with the atomic era. Ever since we dropped a bomb, prior to that, since we've been developing nuclear energy before we dropped the bomb, we have been creating story substructures and subplots and major plots concerning about how radiation affects things. It was never known, it was never said in Kafka's eyes whether or not there was actually radiation involved in this. But in dealing with some of the cliff notes, and yes, I had to read the cliff notes because I don't think I could deal with the book itself, and I'm not dealing with a nightmare situation again, of how this gentleman, a human, turned into a cockroach overnight, and how everyone treated him. If you actually want to see a more theatrical one, try District 9. Or was it District 6? The South American science fiction movie where an alien craft with refugees on there who are very disgusting looking get to be treated as subhumans. Well, how would you like to see a human turn into one of those creatures throughout the story? And here's the thing concerning about dealing with all those differences. I'm not going to start throwing out all the terminology we've been learning at this point over here because I know the differences are everything else we show and promote ourselves. We've been dealing with this since the Gothic Age. Yes, thank Mary Shelley for that one. Her and her Promethean man. And I had to do a major report on a Promethean man a long time ago in a previous English class that dealt with critical thinking in literature. My very first class at Antelope Valley College several years ago. I had a professor trying to compare things to and from, and not to mention dealing with robots as well and how they're dealing with things and machines. Things of differences, things of alien, things of not us, not in thinking, not in feeling, not in form, not in function, not in physicality, not in spirituality, not in mentality. How are we supposed to adapt? How are we supposed to be dealing with things? How are we supposed to be scared of things because we didn't understand? How our own ignorance of the whole universe and everything else, both from the quantum level to the extra solar. We deal with differences on a day-by-day basis here, trying to classify everything into what we like to have in nice small boxes so we can have academic discussions on these things. I know it's the job of the professors and the students in the classes to really tear things apart left and right on how they're trying to analyze the world itself. In some occasions, we see more monsters walking around than we see a cockroach walking around on two legs. We see the monsters in ourselves daily, in our action, in our form, in our words. Ed Wood and other writers like him and other visionaries. Rod Serling was one of those. Some of those who actually contributed to the Outer Limits shows had been demonstrating human interactions left and right, actions and reactions towards the strange and unusual. I grew up under stuff like this. I grew up under stuff of the Kafkaesque, under what was absurd and what was normal. What was normal was commonly accepted, homogenized, bleached, blanched, smoothed, flavorless. You happen to see stuff like what you're reading here, and that would scare the hell out of people left and right because they don't know how to deal with the differences left and right. Much like we deal with the physical differences that we see every day. Either we learned how to not pay attention to them, or just kindly give a side glance, or else we're so unaccustomed to it that we have to stare in horror at it. In the books that we're reading, we're supposed to be looking at all the differences, trying to explain all the differences and the similarities, in so many large words and specified descriptions. I kept thinking, Ed Wood would have a field day with you. A movie maker of the B films, dealing with the rubber prosthetics. He would have a field day with that imagination of yours, because apparently you've gone off the deep end regarding that one, Professor. No, I'll take that back. I've seen a few other professors have actually been swimming in the deep end on this one. And I've had a couple of classes with the same professor already, and I'm still having issues regarding that one, the choices I've made. It is supposed to be a difference. Our generation that we're seeing growing up right now as it is have yet to hear about Ed Wood or even Rod Serling or even Gene Roddenberry for that matter. if they happen to read books in the schools, if they're not banned already, would be of Mary Shelley's book, or possibly Isaac Asimov's robot stories. The generation that grows up right now, they have yet to grow up under the experience that our older generation have. And I'm not talking about our current generation, Professor. I'm talking about our fathers and grandfathers. Or actually, our fathers, actually. When they read about the atomic age, the comics, the mini books, the mini stories, the novellas that came out, and it was reading of that, of how things and how people were looking at each other. I wanted to be one of these writers, professors. I still do. Somewhere or another inside of me, and probably existing in some other electronic zeros and ones right now, are different forms and functions of how to look, how to deal, and how to cope with what's going on in life as it is. I just like the courage to have people look at the damn thing without laughing their asses off. Or dealing with the critique that maybe I am not quote unquote good enough to be anybody like that. But I've always admired the writers because they can look at a situation and their subconscious would be working. Your job as a professor is trying to get the subconscious to be placed into the conscious so we can understand the workings of what's going on. And in that way, we're trying to explain to the higher levels of the academia of how our subconscious works. I just throw Sigmund Freud at them and say, have fun. Because if it's working, why mess with it? But I'd like to understand more. It's just, I have to find the context necessary to explain it to people these days. It's harder and harder when you see the older generation mixed in with the younger generation. The older generation has to find they have to find those stepping stones downwards because we've already had the experiences that we've had to let the younger generation who are coming up the stairs, let them know what they're going to be expecting. And then the thing is, when the newer generation comes up with the newer toys that they have in their hands, we of the paper and scribe, we of the paper and papyrus and the reeds and the quills dipped in with ink look worse because we did the same thing to the other generation who passed on before us, who was marking stuff, weather rock, on another rock to make hieroglyphics, to make scratches, to make a Rosetta Stone, a translation of how literature is supposed to be. The zeros and ones rule us all. That guy's like watching Lord of the Rings. Ugh. How would Tolkien be able to deal with the zeros and ones generation when he was dealing with papyrus? Well, to put it as a comparison at this point. So, in conclusion, Professor, this bug is bugging me. I wanted to let you and Professor J know about that one. If we happen to touch upon Mary Shelley at any point, I would be more than happy to deal with an inanimate object or even dealing with a creature so foul that we look in the mirror and it looks like ourselves. Of course, if it happens to start speaking back at us, we know our hides are at work. Until then, I will see you in the morning, Professor.